As people come in, we'll admit them. So thanks a lot to join this meetup on AI for Good. So today it's my pleasure to welcome Oliver Coste, who is an entrepreneur, and tech executive, AI consultant, and an author. So he has been working in tech for many years now, and he had been working on both sides of the Atlantic in Europe and in the US. So he's now based in New York. So now he's advising companies active in generative AI and AI. And he was formerly a president of a unit of Atos, North America. And before that, he was a CEO and co-founder of a SaaS tech company adopted by Fortune 50 companies. And he has raised VC capital, has long experience in the tech sector. So I read his latest book called Europe Tech on War that you can find on Amazon. I put the link in the meetup on the meetup page. That book received a 2023 Strasser Prize from the French Académie des Sciences Morales et Politiques. So it's a very interesting book that compares the US, Europe, and China in tech, and try to explain why Europe is lagging behind and what are the. So first, try to explain what is the causes, and he's proposed some solution. So today it's going to be more of a conversation, and so I start with the questions. But I think at the second half of this talk, we welcome the audience to ask questions to Oliver. So maybe I'll start now, and so maybe tell us first, like how you came up with the idea of this of your book, right?
Well, it's a funny story. I was watching the debate between the French president Macron and the opposing candidate from the far right, Marine Le Pen, in April 2022. It was the official debate preparing the second round of elections in France for the election of May 2022. And the question was asked by a journalist, why don't we have a Steve Jobs in France? Why don't we have a European Google? And the responses by the French president on one side and the leader of the far right, who could be our next president in 2027 in France, were both so surprising to me and so far away from my tech experience that I thought I was crazy. And I decided to investigate the topic of European situation in tech. So that's really the trigger. April 2022 debate for the second round of the elections.
Okay, so I read your book carefully. So you have some solutions, but we'll come up with the solutions to us later on. So tell us about the landscape. So we have like three regions that you cover. So the Europe, US, and China. So can you give us a bit the landscape of what's first, one thing that is surprising, that how China is so far ahead now, and in AI, especially given its history and why Europe seems to be like ahead of Europe. So tell us like the landscape. When you started to study these questions, what did you find?
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, there are many indicators to test the capacity of each continent in tech. And one of the good indicators, and I'll use several, is the amount of research and development, the amount invested in R&D every year by companies. So the level of investment in new products, in new ideas. And you see on this slide, I hope you can see my slide.
Yes.
Okay, that China, which was at around zero 25 years ago, has 80 billions of investment by companies every year. The US are still far ahead at 300 billions. 300 billions is a huge amount that Google, Amazon, and the thousands of smaller companies are investing in R&D every year in the US. And Europe is at 50, stable. So you see that there is huge gap between Europe and the US, and you see that China has accelerated very fast. You see this evolution here over the last 20 years. Japan, Germany, and France had a significant share of the worldwide R&D in tech, and these shares have decreased brutally over the last 20 years. So, for example, Germany was at 8% in 2005 and went down to 2% of the world R&D. France was at 6, it went to 2. So you see a brutal evolution, a collapse of the role of Europe in the world tech, which is today the most important technology, the current industrial revolution. So this is the first indicator that was very surprising to me when I investigated the power of each continent.
Yeah, and as a reference for maybe for the American audience, that France plus Germany, the population is probably 1/3, right? 1/3 of the US population, right? But you see that the share of R&D is much smaller than than the US, and that's great. You talk in your book. You mentioned the tech champions, right? So we know the American names. But can you tell us about the European champion, if there are any? Yeah.
So that's a second indicator, which is interesting, and that everybody knows, as you mentioned, we all know the role of Google, the role of Microsoft, the role of Meta, now NVIDIA. And when you look at the amount of R&D invested by the largest investors in the world, you see the slide, which shows in red American companies, in green Chinese companies, and in blue European companies. And you see that Europe is a smaller player, both in number of champions and in amounts invested by each champion. The European champions are the German SAP, the Finnish Nokia, the Swedish Ericsson, and the Dutch ASML. But they invest every year around 5 billion, which is a lot, but it is small as compared to what Meta or Microsoft or Huawei are investing every year, which is around 25 to 30 billions. So this discrepancy was a big surprise to me too.
Mm-hmm. And in your experience, because a lot of this knowledge is like from your own working experience, can you tell us like when the Chinese first came up, came on the tech scene, right? Like the first ZTE and Huawei, right? When you were working in the mobile area, and how did it emerge like suddenly? Yeah.
This is a very interesting evolution. In 2000, when I joined Alcatel, Europe was the leading continent in telecom technologies. So the standards, the 2G, 3G, 4G standards were defined in Europe. The leading companies were Europeans. It was Ericsson, Siemens, Alcatel, and Nokia. And there were good players in the US too, like Nortel, Lucent, Motorola, and Cisco. So 8 companies were controlling the world to a large extent. That was 2000. And in 2007, we learned from our customers that Huawei and ZTE were ahead of us in terms of technology. We thought they were just small copying companies, taking our IP and replicating with no real know-how. We were very arrogant about that. And we discovered in 2007, so it's already 16, 17 years ago now, that they were ahead of us. They were investing more. Their products were better. And indeed, this made both Europe and European and American companies collapse. Motorola stopped. Nortel went bankrupt. Lucent was sold. Alcatel was sold. Siemens was sold. So out of the 8 champions of the time, which were all Western, you now only have 3 surviving, Cisco, Ericsson, and Nokia, and 2 major Chinese players who are Huawei and ZTE. The moment when it started to hit us very brutally was 2007. And what is interesting too, is that it took the US authorities 10 years to react to this situation. So only in 2017 did the US authorities start to have an active policy against the Chinese players in telecom.
And how did they get the technology? The Huawei, ZTE. Did they start to work with the European American companies, or how was the technological transfer done? Or I think that for a long time, I think to invest in China, you had also to do some voluntary like technological transfer too. So did it help the Chinese?
Absolutely. So Alcatel was one of the first companies to invest in China. So in the mid 80s, at the time of Deng Xiaoping, and the rules were that you had to build a JV with a local company. So for Alcatel, it was Alcatel Shanghai Bell, which was created around 83, 84 in Shanghai, and with 51% shares owned by the Chinese government. So we had to transfer the know-how to this subsidiary, but which we did not control. And of course, the know-how was progressively absorbed by Chinese engineers and reused by other companies, of course, but that's normal way how knowledge is transferred progressively from one country to another one. There was no surprise. We knew that. What was surprising for us was that Huawei invested in the beginning in the 2000 years, so 20 years later, 3 times more than what we were capable of doing. So when we put 1,000 engineers on a new project, like, I don't know, the evolution to 3G at the time, Huawei was putting 3,000 engineers on that same topic. When we were putting, I don't know, 10,000 engineers on a new optical transfer solution, they were putting 30,000 engineers. So they were just investing more with more engineers, with the same knowledge, the same capacity, the same good engineers, but 3 times more. So eventually they were beating us in the delivery of excellent products. And that's why so many Western companies collapsed between 2007 and 2015.
It seems to be happening again with EV cars today, right? Like in the EV space, I think the Chinese companies are sometimes probably ahead of European and American car companies, right? So that's,
there's absolutely no doubt that there is an industrial policy by the Chinese government to create ecosystems that are very successful. It seems that my video is frozen. Can you see me move, or it's frozen?
No, but we can hear you, so it's okay.
Okay, but I can probably switch to another camera and see whether it will work better. Let me quit and come back. It will take me a second.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Maybe if you stop sharing your screen, I don't know, it might help.
I have Zoom frozen, so
okay.
I need to reboot. It is.
Okay.
So I'm sorry about that. So yes, there was a big shock on the telecom world that was really massively dominated by Europeans 25 years ago. And this shock was triggered by the Chinese world. And it's clear that the Chinese have today the capacity to have better technologies than Western companies in EV, in drones, in solar panels, in many areas where their market, their engineering capability, their number of PhDs are at least at par, if not better than that of the US or of Europe.
And how did it come up as an industrial policy? So was it a will to catch up, a will to to become independent, or to? I mean, you mentioned in your book that century of humiliation, right? So this context is interesting.
Well, you're totally right to raise the point. China was famous until 30 years ago as the continent which was the most advanced and the most powerful in the 16th, 17th, 18th century in the world. It was the first the world leading power in the 18th century. But it systematically refused to integrate European technology over these centuries. So they refused to integrate the clock, they refused to integrate the boats that were coming from Portugal or from England. They refused to integrate later in the 18th and 19th century, the steam engine. And for clear internal political reasons, they decided to reject any rival integration within the Chinese society and economy of any European innovation. At the same time, you had in Europe, around 1800, the first industrial revolution driven by coal and by the steam engine. And the British proposed to China to integrate, to sell, to trade on these technologies. And the Chinese emperor rejected that. But 40 years later, in 1840, the British initiated a war against China. The British were 30 million, the Chinese were 300 millions, 10 times bigger. But the British had steam boats, and they crushed the Chinese empire militarily because of the boats against junks and because of guns. So the Chinese spiraled into the civil war and the colonization, and then the external conquest by Japan. So over 100 years, it was a disaster. It was famine. It was horrible. And they had Mao for 40 more years. And knowing that since the 80s, it's clear that China wants to be a leading power in technology to avoid the mistakes they were doing in the 17th, 18th, 19th century of rejecting European technology. They want to be leading. And one of the examples I discovered in my investigation was this quote by Xi Jinping a few years ago. So let me try to share my screen. Here it is. This quote is interesting. If you can see it, that's sharing. Let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, on the left, you see Xi Jinping saying 3 years ago, technological innovation has become the main battleground of the global playing field, and competition for tech dominance will grow unprecedentedly fierce. The tech dominance, they are after tech dominance. And this goal is clearly the outcome of their collapse in 1839, 1840, during the First Opium War. They want to be dominant with the most recent technologies. And you see, if you go a bit back in history, steam engine was the first industrial revolution around 1800. And 40 years later, you had the first war fought on steam engine, which was the Opium Wars. The oil and the modern engines were invented around 1900, at the beginning of the last century. And they were invented in Germany, in France, and a bit in the US too. And 40 years later, the Second World War was totally driven by dominance with internal combustion engines, with aircraft and tanks and aircraft carriers. And you see today the same. The war in Ukraine is fought to a large extent on precision missiles, on drones, on observation from the sky. So elements which are totally driven by the current industrial revolution. So you totally understand that there is today a Cold War between the US and China on tech dominance and who will be leading. And Europe is out of the game today. So that's one of the reasons why I entitled my book, Europe, Tech and War. War is a clear outcome of the current race for tech.
Okay, thank you. So let's go back to Europe. We talk about China. For Europe, so there's, of course, the amount of R&D, but even given the amount of R&D, you are saying that maybe it's not well spent, especially the commercialization aspect of R&D, right? So maybe the R&D then maybe one skill that the US has is to transform like R&D into products, into sales, into revenues, but maybe Europe is lagging behind. Can you like elaborate on that?
Well, that can be elaborated, or I can give examples
Yeah.
that hit me very hard and drove me to emigrate to the US. I created 3 startup companies, and each time it was based in Paris, in the core of Europe, trying to develop technologies for the European market, based on European spectrum, based on European technologies. And each time I could not sell to European companies, and I got inbound calls, non-solicited calls from US companies like Dish Networks, like Microsoft, like IBM, who were calling me to sell the technologies to them because they wanted to test it. It was new, it was innovative, and that's how my startups started to be successful commercially. All the time, the discussions I had with the richest possible customers in France or in Germany, like LVMH or BNP Paribas or Deutsche Telekom, or I don't know, in the UK, H3G or O2, they were reluctant to test something that was not already proven in the US. So the question I got all the time is your technology proven already? If it is not proven, we cannot test it because we would need to hire teams. And if it fails, we need to let them go. And we cannot do that. In the US, Microsoft immediately hired 40 people to test the technology. Dish Networks had hired 20 people to implement the technology that we were selling to them. And sometimes it was failing, they were shutting it down, no problem. Amazon all the time launches technologies with hundreds of people or thousands of people working in it, and it doesn't work. Mayday never worked, or the Fire Phone from Amazon never worked. So they shut it down. They let people go. Not a problem. This flexibility, this capacity to test a new innovation is inexistent in the European market. So you don't have a market to test innovation in Europe. You have to go to the US or to the rest of the world. And this is a key obstacle to the development of technologies in Europe.
Okay, yeah, that's excellent. So this is really in the core of your book, that the flexibility that you have in the US. Can you describe to like American audience like what's the cost of the restructuring of like when if you let someone a team go in Europe versus the US, or on what, because people might not realize the big difference.
Well, I mean, this is my professional experience in large companies like Alcatel-Lucent or Atos. I had to run teams in Europe and in the US in both companies. And when you have to let people go in the US, you know the rule. It's, well, you have to give limited advance notice. It's usually 10 minutes or 1 hour. Your job is terminated, and you're going to leave the company by the end of the day. And you give a severance pay of 3-4 months, depending on the history of the person within the company. That's the rule in California, in Texas, in New York, depending on each state's law. In Europe, it's totally different. You have to launch a process which will last, let's say, 1 year in France, 1.5 years in Germany, 1 year in Italy, more than 1 year in the Netherlands or in Sweden. And at the end of the process, you may be allowed to lay off people, and you will give a severance pay of about 1 year, again, depending on the history. So the total cost in France or Germany is around 2 to 3 years of salaries, when it is 3 months in the US. So it's a ratio of 1 to 10 when you have to stop an activity, where simply your technology doesn't work anymore because it's been replaced by a new technology. You have to lay off thousands of people. It costs hundreds of millions, sometimes billions in Europe, and it costs tens of millions, sometimes hundreds in the US, but 10 times less. Makes a big difference. And to give examples of that, I computed the total restructuring costs that Alcatel had to pay between 2000 and 2010 over 10 years. That is 10 billions, which represents 7% of the revenues every year. You imagine that you have to pay 7%. It's almost the level of R&D just to restructure teams that you do not need anymore. Atos is today hit by it's an IT company based in France that acquired Siemens IT and Xerox IT a few years ago, so it's significantly present in the US. This company is currently almost in bankruptcy. It's public because it has to restructure tens of thousands of people, which represents several billions that it cannot afford. So it has no solution. So for tech companies, moving from one technology to another one, from fixed telecom to mobile telecom, from data center management to the cloud, requires billions in restructuring where it doesn't cost so much, 10 times less in the US or in China or in India. And this is the core reasons for the decline of large European groups like Alcatel, Siemens, or Atos.
Yeah, I think for people who don't know Atos, Atos was very well respected IT company and was specialized in taking care of managing data centers for large companies. But when the cloud computing came, the AWS, Azure, and so on, they got hit very hard, right? Because you have another way to manage like data center. You don't have to own your own data center. Just pay like Amazon or Microsoft or now Google Cloud to do it. So really to adapt, you had to restructure. You had to change your business model and so on. And this is very expensive, as you explained. It's very true. So that's probably impacts also the key difference that you show in your book, the difference between incremental and disruptive innovation. Right? Can you elaborate on that?
It's a very important element. Let's look at a few things. Let me move to this. A typical disruptive innovation that everybody has in mind is the iPhone. The iPhone did not exist before Apple launched it. Nobody had any idea that you would have a computer in the hand a few years later. It was unexpected, and it changed totally the world of mobile communications. So you see here the impact of the launch of the iPhone by Steve Jobs in 2007 on Nokia and Samsung and Apple. You see that Nokia, which was dominating the world at the time, with more than 50% market share, with 300 million devices sold every year, collapsed entirely within 3 years or 4 years. It was very brutal because there was a disruptive innovation that was the iPhone, invented by Apple, that came to the market that made another industry disappear. It's like a steam engine in 1900 being totally disrupted by the internal combustion engine, and all the steam trains and steamboats have been replaced by new technologies. That's typically a disruptive innovation. You see that BMW, for example, which was created around 1900, is still investing every year a lot in innovation, but that's improving their cars. That's improving air conditioning, improving brakes, improving the engine, improving the power, improving the energy efficiency. It's not disrupting something totally new. So you see the revenues of BMW, which are growing nicely every year, but it's not an exponential growth as what you see with the Apple iPhone, or on the left side here, Facebook, which was a total disruptive innovation. We changed entirely the advertising market. The advertising market was entirely on paper until then, and suddenly it was on Facebook or on YouTube. And that was totally unexpected. This is disruptive innovation. This is what the Americans do brilliantly. And this is based on launching plenty of projects and failing all the time. While incremental innovation, like improving your car or moving from 2G to 3G and from 3G to 4G, you know that there will be a market. You know which technologies can be implemented, so you can predict what's going to happen. in disruptive innovation, you have no idea. It's totally unpredictable, and you have to launch thousands of projects for some of them to become a large disruptive innovation like OpenAI 18 months ago. This is another typical disruptive innovation. And to illustrate my point, what I want to show with this slide is that Amazon, Google, and Microsoft are kings of disruptive innovation because they invest all the time in projects that fail. Look at the Fire Phone, look at Mayday, like Google Duo, Google Hangout, Google Voice, all that are major failures. Skype, Nokia acquired by Microsoft, Bing, Windows Mobile, Groove, all that are examples of major projects for these companies that failed. And because they fail a lot, they sometimes succeed in something totally unpredicted, like the success of Gmail, or the success of the Kindle, or the success of Microsoft Teams. They invest in plenty of projects, and 1 out of 10, 1 out of 50 will work brilliantly, and that's how it works. This has become impossible in Europe, and that's the core story of my book. But I'll let continue.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
better if we continue.
Another example that I think that follows your story is BlackBerry, right? BlackBerry in Canada, that was like disrupted by the iPhone, right? And even though BlackBerry at the time was very innovative, but somehow it lagged behind. Even when the iPhone came with the phone without the keyboard, right? They wouldn't believe that people would adopt like a device without a keyboard, and so it took a while for BlackBerry to adapt, right?
And if you think at what's happening currently, AI, ChatGPT, and Gemini, and Llama 3 are disruptive innovation. What's interesting is that everybody knew that AI was coming. So it was predictable that the models and the computing capacity and the systems would get better and better. What was totally unpredicted, even by them, was the commercial success of ChatGPT in November 2022, 18 months ago. Even ChatGPT did not expect it to be such a success, where you and I and millions of others use ChatGPT every day. And this is certainly a disruptive innovation for Google, because Google was the typical search engine, but now you have a better response, or a better phrasing of the response in ChatGPT, or in Copilot with Microsoft. So this is unpredicted. This is the result of thousands of projects that have been carried out over 30 years. AI is nothing new. It's a lot of projects. And OpenAI suddenly created something that was an amazing commercial success and totally unpredicted. This is typically a disruptive innovation.
And do you think there's some cultural explanation to it, that maybe Europeans are, at least we know that in France people don't like failure, right? We're kind of very adverse to failure, and it's difficult to recover even socially, right? The people dislike that. Whereas in the US, failure is okay. The people fail, they do it again, so it's totally like acceptable. But maybe in Europe, is that do you see a difference? Is it?
I was very interested in this culture explanation of the failure of Europe in tech. Is it a cultural issue? Is it because you and me, trained at l'École Polytechnique, have no culture of taking risk, of disruptive innovation? Or is it something else? And I was hesitant about this argument for two reasons. First, I worked both in the US and in Europe, and I didn't find that my US colleagues were much more innovative than my European colleagues. I didn't find a very strong difference in culture within large companies. The second element is that I consider that I have the same culture as my grandparents and great-grandparents, who were innovative 100 years ago and invented Peugeot, or invented Renault, or invented Schlumberger. These are concrete examples of disruptive innovation that happened in Europe. And all disruptive innovation over 500 years, between printing in 1450 and the Second World War in 1940, was invented by disruptive innovation and the culture of risk in Europe. So what has changed? So I had doubts about this cultural analysis. And when I put the figures on a map, on a business plan, taking into account the cost of failure, the cost of restructuring that I was mentioning, I come to the following conclusion, which I show on this slide. When you create a project with, let's say, 10 millions, I mean, the one of my startups, we invested 10 millions in R&D. So I used that as a reference. You're a large company, you put 10 millions in a new project. You succeed, it will generate $8 to $10 million of EBIT. So it will increase the value of your company by 10 times that, 80 millions. If you fail, you've lost 10 millions in R&D and a bit of marketing and sales. That's the case in the US. But if you do the same in Europe, you invest 10 millions, you succeed, you have increased the value of your company by the same 80 millions in blue. But if you fail and you're not growing fast, you have to lay off the 85 people that you have hired for this project. And that's an additional 17 million on top of the 10 million in R&D that you have already invested. If you do that 5 times and that only one project works, which is typical of success rates at large companies in tech, 20% success rate, you're sure to earn money in the US and you're sure to lose money in Europe, because the cost of the 4 failing projects, the cost of restructuring the 4 failing projects will be higher than the added value of the succeeding project. So you should not invest logically, just mechanically, financially. It's unreasonable to invest in disruptive innovation or in risky innovation in Europe. You should not do it because of the impact of restructuring costs. And that can explain the lack of appetite for risk that has come over the last 50 years in Europe since we implemented rules on laying off people in European companies. It makes no sense to invest at risk because you're going to lose money systematically. While if you do that in the US or in China or in India, you will make money. And that is, to me, a better explanation than the cultural element. So to me, the culture is probably a consequence of the economic conditions that have been put in place over the last 50 years in Europe, and that can be changed. Because deep inside Europeans, we still have the same culture as 200 years ago, 100 years ago. Culture of a perfect.
A case in point is that a lot of innovation or startups are created by immigrants in the US. So who come with like a non-American culture by definition, right? They come with a culture from their home countries and they innovate a lot in the US. So it's yeah, I believe that
we're both immigrants. Yeah. We know why we love being in the US. It's because we can do that. We can find customers. We can raise money. It's not that we have a different culture from that of Americans. It's just that we have the appetite of moving to the US, where the financial conditions, the economic conditions are there to test and launch innovation. This
at the same time, you could say that I mean, I don't know, people have studied that immigrants who get attracted to the US are maybe the ones who are the most risk-loving. People who are too risk-averse stay home, you know, maybe.
But I mean, they were not leaving Europe until 1940.
That's true.
So there was no reason for them to leave Europe until 1940. And after the Second World War, Europe was poor. So it took 30 years to come back to a level of technology at par with the US. But then with the first oil shock in 1973, we started implementing rules about restructuring that were there to protect blue collars facing mass unemployment. But it blocked the appetite of engineers to invest on new projects. And you see that over the last 50 years, Europe has not invented neither Google, nor Microsoft, nor Apple, nor TikTok, nor Alibaba, nor Huawei. Nothing has been developed in Europe. And that is what needs to be changed.
Okay, so excellent. So this is, so we are at the point where, So we have a understanding of what are the causes. So what are the solutions? Do we have to become like the US, employment at will, and you get fired, like you get your box, you're cut off the office, and or your login credentials disappear, or is there an alternative? I think.
Okay, so there is a fear in Europe that we would have to become Americans to be able to innovate, that we would have to adopt the American model with no protection at all. And this is absolutely not necessary. The European social model is based on 4 pillars, which are here shown at this slide. So benefits for unemployed, health coverage, free health coverage, free education, and pension system that are generous. These 4 pillars have 0 negative impact on innovation. They're good for innovation. They're protective and they're good. So there's no reason to touch to all these points. The difficulty is only on employment protection laws, which are not core to the European social model. It does not exist in Switzerland. It does not exist in Denmark. It does not exist in Ireland. And you see these countries are more innovative and way richer than the rest of Europe. So within the European model, you can adopt, let's say, the Danish model, which is called flex security, which means a company can lay off people within 3 months with very limited severance pays. It's fast and it's not expensive. But then the state, the social system, make sure that people get benefits because they're unemployed, continue to have health coverage, and find a job easily. And what we're proposing to do with an economist called Jan Coatanlem, we've worked on that to find concrete solution within the European social model, a la Danish. It's sufficient to do that for engineers, for high-paid people, highly skilled people. You do not have to impose this change to blue-collar people who get 1,500 euros per month. You need to do that for the limited amount of employees who work on tech, either in the tech industry or at customers of the tech industry, banks, luxury goods, car industry. These people are paid 4,000, 5,000 euros per month or more. So if you propose a system where it's flexible but secure, because these people will get employment benefits, and they were in a world where it's easy to find another job because there's such a demand for good engineers and good salespeople, and they are highly skilled. So they're rich, they're skilled, they have no mass unemployment issue. We could propose flex security for that level of employees, and not the rest, not the 90% who are at risk of mass unemployment. It would not change the European social model, and it would enable to invest at risk again and bring back to Europe all the brilliant minds that today go to New York or to San Francisco to develop their innovative ideas. They would stay in Europe and they would find money in Europe because it would be profitable to invest in such ideas in Europe. So there's no need to make a big revolution. It's just an adaptation of the current system that would enable hundreds of billions of money to be invested again in European innovation. It's not a big deal to change that. We just need to address the topic and convince the European populations to do that.
When I was reading your book, I was thinking of this a topic I don't know very well, but because the third actor, so you have the US and Europe, you have China too. But the labor market in China is a bit, it's not like in the US, right? So there's also restructuring costs. If you are large companies, you have, someone for the Communist Party on your board or like inside. So it's not that easy to get rid of labor, but I know maybe it is. I'm not sure. Do you have any insights on that?
It's interesting. Your question is excellent, and I don't have a precise answer on that. What struck me when investigating a little bit China, which I've never worked in, so I don't know China intimately, is that apart from Huawei, if you look at the current Chinese champions in tech, this is a good description of the leading investment companies investing in R&D in China. you see the leading ones are in tech. It's Huawei, Tencent, Alibaba, Baidu, ZTE, and NetEase, Jeremy, and you have TikTok somewhere not far away. These companies, apart from Huawei and ZTE, are all companies which are the result of venture capital funds coming from the US. Alibaba was funded by Morgan Stanley. Tencent was funded by Kleiner Perkins or Sequoia, I forgot, and so on and so on. So it is the US VC model that has funded the Chinese tech leaders, with the exception of Huawei, which were the pure result of an industrial policy a la De Gaulle or Pompidou in France, with a clear market share guaranteed and a support from the government.
They used to have link with the military, right? I think from
yes,
some of the founders. Yeah.
Absolutely. So there is a link with the military, similar to you have links with the military on many of the French industrial policies of the 60s and 70s. Of course, Airbus and Concorde were linked to the capacity to do aircraft for war, so fighter aircraft. But here, what's interesting is that the Chinese model that has been so successful with TikTok, with Alibaba, with Tencent, which are the leading company in the world for gaming, which is a major market too. These are companies that were funded by American VC companies. And I'm pretty convinced that the model was similar. So there was the capacity to adapt full speed. If you have the good relationship, I would suspect, but again, I'm not sure. If you have good relationship with the local authorities and the Communist Party, you can probably adapt fast. While in Europe, you have to follow the rule. It will be 18 months, and you cannot lay off people without the agreement of the Work Council in Germany. So you have no way out. Probably, I'm sure in India and probably in China, you have ways to adapt to a change of technology and to lay off 10
I suspect that in China, maybe even the officials are stakeholders. Maybe I don't know the shareholders, but it's stakeholders in the success of those the local companies or local tech companies. Okay, thank you. So I would like to let other people ask questions. So please, if you want to ask questions to Oliver, raise your hands, and we let you, ask your questions. And so please go ahead. And maybe anyone want to ask any questions to Oliver? I find this topic very interesting. So while you're thinking about your questions, maybe let me ask you about. So you're also AI consultant, AI on generative AI and so on. So what's your view on AI? Can Europe win the war on AI, or if you had tomorrow you had a Ministry of Industry or Ministry of Research Innovation in France, what would you do?
Let me start with the current status. I'm working for the computing capacity that is necessary for training AI models. So basically, what I'm working on is how to provide large data centers built with thousands or tens of thousands of NVIDIA GPUs on which you train the latest models all the time. Meta, Microsoft, ChatGPT, Google are working on such large data centers to build and train their models and offer all of us these amazing tools that is Copilot or ChatGPT or Gemini. It's interesting to look at the volume of investment in this world today. It's pretty simple to analyze it, because basically when you build a data center, you have half of the cost, which is NVIDIA and NVIDIA GPUs, and half of the cost, which is power and storage and space and networking, so other stuff. So when you know that NVIDIA is selling 1 billion, it means that somebody is investing 2 billions in a computing capacity for AI. In 2024, just this year, NVIDIA will sell approximately 80 billions of GPUs. It means that there are investors in the world who are investing about 160 billions in NVIDIA GPUs. So based on that and a few other elements, we estimate that there's about over 120 billions of investment by Google, by Meta, by Microsoft, by X, by Tesla, by pharmaceutical companies, by hedge funds in AI capacity, AI computing capacity, more than 120 billions just this year. Probably around 50 billions in the US, but it's not exactly clear how much. And I couldn't find 2 billions of investment in Europe. So the ratio between the US and Europe is not 1 to 6 as it is in R&D. In AI, it's 1 to 50. It's huge. And this lack of investment in AI capacity is very scary for Europe. Europe has no data. All the data that Europeans are using are owned by Microsoft or by Gmail or by Meta and WhatsApp. So they have no data. They have no computing capacity at par with what the US or China have. So how can they be autonomous in AI, which is just the result of a large amount of data and a large amount of computing capacity? It's like trying to build a car with no oil and no engine. You need at least the two of that to be able to make a car. So you have brilliant companies in Europe like Mistral or Helsing or Aleph Alpha, which are developing beautiful algorithms, but Europe lacks the core of what is necessary for AI on the long term, which is data and computing capacity. So what would I do? I would strongly recommend to ministers, and that's what I'm doing currently when I go to Europe, recommending to the European Commission and to the European Central Bank and to the governments in Germany, in France, and everywhere to make this change in labor laws so that investment, private investment, can come back reasonably in Europe. And there are hundreds of billions which are available, which could come back because they are available. They're investing for the moment in India and China and the US and the Middle East, but certainly not in Europe. And they could come to Europe because there are plenty of good things in Europe which would lead investors to come to Europe, or would lead European rich people to put their spare money into investment in Europe.
Yeah. What is so interesting is that you count the numbers of $1 trillion companies in the US and versus Europe. I don't even know if Europe there's any single company worth over $1 trillion. So it's but when you're worth over $1 trillion, maybe you have like more capital, or it's very easier to buy all these like NVIDIA GPUs, right? So okay, so I don't see any questions, but you can find Oliver on LinkedIn. I recommend you to get his book and to follow this. This is a very interesting topic. There are also lessons for the US for its own like industrial policy. If you want to, the US wants to stay ahead. There's things that we can learn from that. And even like you have policy options too. So maybe we shouldn't become like Europe in terms of protecting the labor market. Like a shift like that. But at the same time, there are things that we can learn from Europe and China and from Oliver's book. So thank you very much, Oliver, and let's keep in touch and we'll talk again. Next talk will be on July 16 with François Candelon, he used to be the director of BCG, the BCG Henderson Institute, a think tank of BCG. I'll talk about generative AI and the kind of research they did at BCG. So thank you very much and have a nice rest of your day.
Thank you very much, Min. It was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
For listening to all that. Thank you.
Thank you all.